Hey, let's talk about methods.
Alright, so we mentioned methods a number of times. Well, let's talk about how we declare and create a method specifically in the Java language. Now, first off, methods get a whole bunch of different names. They could be called methods, functions, routines, subroutines. It all really means the same. Basically, it's instructions to do something. And that's it. To do something. Alright. So we want to be able to teach the computer how to do things. We might want to teach a computer how to get the average of a few numbers. Or we might want to teach a computer how to print out a message to the screen. Or we might want to teach a computer how to open up a program. But either way, we usually give a simple name to that task, like open up Microsoft Word, or get the average of these three numbers. But really, the steps to do that are a bit more complicated. So, declaring a method is kind of like declaring a variable in that we're going to just give a name to a set of instructions. So there's a few parts to this. Let's break it down by part. Let's start with the part we just mentioned, the name. So, how about we just call it method name for right now. Will be the very non-creative name for a method. And just to make sure we always know what we're talking about, I'll write it underneath. This is the name step. Now, the telltale sign you're working with a method in Java again is that right after the name, you'll always see a set of parentheses. Now, I'm putting a space here for a reason. We'll come back to that. But method name with a set of parentheses says, ooh, that's definitely a method. X is a variable. Y is a method. I can tell because of those parentheses. So that's what kind of makes them distinguishable. Now, there's other parts needed for this method. Before we talk about the name, if we were to work with a variable, we would talk about the type. And the same thing happens here with a little tiny twist. We still want to talk about the type, except we're going to say the return type. And what that means is that when you perform a method, when you perform a task, you might, that's the key word, you might get information back. So if I were to ask you to do something for me, so a set of instructions that I'm going to call by name, like go to the supermarket and get me a dozen eggs. There's a lot of involved steps with that. You'd have to get into a car, start the car, drive the car to the supermarket, get out of the car, walk into the supermarket, find the eggs, pick them up, put them in your basket, walk up to the counter, pay the cashier, take the eggs, put them back in the car, drive it's involved. There's a lot of steps to it. But I give it the name, go to the supermarket and get me eggs. So the return type is eggs. I expect eggs on the other end. But if I were instead to tell you, hey, go out and just play for a half hour. Well, you would still go do something, but I don't expect any information coming back to me. So the return type says, what type of information should this method give back when it's done? Now, sometimes there is a return type, sometimes there's not. But you can't have this space empty. So if there's no return type, you would have the return type void, which means there is nothing to return. If the method returned an integer, tell me the biggest number, or tell me your age, it would be an int. If I wanted to get a word, tell me your name, it would return a string. Alright, so we have a return type. There's also these other things that come in front of a method that really don't matter so much when you're just first starting the program, but they become important later on. We're going to call these, this is a whole modifiers. Alright, and these modifiers set some properties for the method. So what we will mostly see in our class are the modifiers public and static. And what those mean in a nutshell, I'll talk about them once and then forget about them for the time being. Public says, who can call this method? So a public method means other computer programs can call the method, can ask our program to do this thing. So if the method was say your name, that might be a public method because anybody could ask you to say your name. As opposed to a private method, which only gets done internally. So thinking about your deepest, darkest secrets, that's a thing, There's steps to it, but that might not be something public. You don't want to be walking down the street and have somebody say, "Tell me your deepest, darkest secrets." That's probably a private method. Static tells us whether or not the method has to do with an instance of an object or the idea of an object. And that's a bit heavy when you're first starting the program, but a good way to distinguish between the two is thinking about math. Math is not a tangible thing. So if we were to write a computer program called math, something like get the average of numbers would be a static method, because you don't need any physical object to do that. If I were to write a method, tell me your name or tell me your age, that would be a non-static method, because you need to have an actual person to have a name or an actual person to have an age. It wouldn't make sense to ask an empty room, "How old are you?" Which is an empty room. "How old are you?" See, nobody responds because you need an instance to do that. But modifiers we're not going to worry about so much, so let's just leave it there. So this is declaring our method, but really we need two more parts. One is very essential, and that essential part is this. We're going to put a open curly brace here and a closed curly brace here. And what we just did is we defined a region where we could write instructions. So I can now go and list all the instructions that get done when I call this method. So this is called a code block, from curly brace to curly brace. And a code block is used to kind of bundle a whole bunch of lines of code together, which is exactly what we want to do with the method. We're bundling a lot of lines together, giving it a name, and saying, when I write this, do this. Now, there's one other part. You may notice I left a little bit of a gap in these parentheses. And the reason was there's one other part that you don't have to have, but you might want to have methods, and those are called parameters. So earlier I talked about going to the store. So it would make a lot of sense to have a method, public static, void, or maybe we'd have a return type groceries, and say go to the supermarket. Now, I could ask you to go to the supermarket and not get me anything. I could just say, go to the supermarket, then come back. But usually, if I'm going to ask you to go to the supermarket, I would probably put some parameters on it. Go to the supermarket, get me eggs. Go to the supermarket, get me milk. Go to the supermarket, get me tacos. Whatever it is you want. Now, all of those actions are more or less the same thing. The only thing that changes is the thing I'm asking you for. So rather than have one method for how to get tacos from the supermarket, how to get milk from the supermarket, how to get eggs from the supermarket, we write one method, how to get something from the supermarket, and then we just say, what's the thing you need in here? So this set of parentheses is kind of like a portal that says, if I want to refer to something in these instructions, you got to put it in here, pass it in. So we might say, string, let's call it input. So in this case, if you want to do this method, you have to give me a string called input to make it happen. That input can now be referred to down here. So basically what we did is we declared a variable in the method definition so that we can refer to it down in the instructions. Right. So that's setting up a method. We haven't used it, we haven't called it. Essentially what we did is we told a computer, hey, here's how to do something, but we never asked it to do something. That'll be in the next video.